Today I want to talk about kind of the nature of social psychology and the nature of personality as well. And the whole field of social and personality psychology is one that I care very deeply about, and at the same time it's one that I've had some degree of ambivalence about in terms of having that identity. Am I really a social and personality psychologist? Because in many ways over the course of my career I've kind of careened in and out of the field, but as I've gotten older I've started to appreciate that really I am very much a social and personality psychologist, not because of the groups I'm in, but in terms of the topics that I study. And today I'd like to really explore how the field of social and personality psychology is changing. Now before I do that, I need to do a couple of, or at least say one thing. Some of the people in this room make a huge distinction between social and personality psychology. I don't understand the difference. To me, it's all the same. So if you're one of those people and I say social psychology, I want in your mind for you to think, oh, he really means personality psychology, and vice versa. It's all the same to me, because all of us are interested in the relationship that we, the human, has with other humans and other organisms for that matter. And in my discussion today, I want us to start thinking about the nature of what we study and how we can do this in a way that that we break down some of the barriers that are part of this, that we have imposed on ourselves over the last several years. Now, it's interesting that this topic, because I'll be talking about the breaking down of barriers, how we can start studying social and personality in a much wider range than we have in the past. And in many ways, today's talk is a talk that actually could be given at conferences of different fields all over the world, because there's been a really interesting change over since about the 1950s, and certainly in the United States and in Western Europe. The first issue that I want to talk about is that we're in the midst of a quiet revolution. That there has been since about the 1950s, there's been this slow balkanization of social and personality psychology. For those of you who aren't familiar with balkanization, that refers to the Balkans, which is the peninsula that was part of the Ottoman Empire, which was Turkey and Greece and Albania and Macedonia and so forth. That was all essentially one area, and then after the First World War, these areas, and the Second World War, all areas kind of essentially collapsed, and these different countries emerged, and people immediately started to identify with their home country and immediately learned to truly hate everybody else. But as part of this balkanization, each group developed a really powerful identity and stopped interacting with people outside of their own area. Now, this is part of a general social psychological principle. We know about it in social psychology. It's talked a lot about in anthropology and other areas. That as groups grow, they change in terms of their identity and their structure. This has been something that's happened in academics throughout the United States. After World War II, universities and the number of students going to all universities was still relatively low. And then as the baby boomers came along, the population of students who were at colleges doubled and got huge, and consequently the faculty got very large as well. And with this, what happened was we went from groups where people were kind of in small groups, and they had kind of an identity among themselves. The groups got bigger and bigger, and as the groups got bigger, the people broke into smaller subgroups, learning to hate one another and so forth, and so there has been this change in identification. Now, I want to give you a little bit of background on this. I teach at the University of Texas, where I actually did my graduate work. In the 1950s, long before I was in graduate school, the psychology department had about 15 faculty. There was no social psychology area. There was no developmental area. It was every department around the country, major departments had two areas: experimental psychology and maybe clinical psychology. Social psychologists talked to developmental psychologists. Everybody talked to one another. And then between about 1950 and about the late 1960s, departments all grew quite a bit, and the University of Texas increased to about 40 or 50 faculty. And because it's such an administrative headache, they broke the department into smaller areas. And the University of Texas was like most, where you had your social and your developmental and your clinical and so forth. In so doing, the social psychologists started talking more and more to social psychologists, and they talked less and less to these other areas. A similar kind of thing was happening nationwide. When I was in graduate school, there was one conference for psychologists. It was the APA meeting. And those of the few people in this room who are roughly my age remember with great fondness what APA was, because basically you'd go listen to talks by physiological psychologists, learning psychologists, clinical and others, and this was part of the general education. But again, as APA grew, the social psychologists they felt a little bit left out, and everybody felt left out. And so we started to balkanize. We started to spend more and more time with each other. And this balkanization occurred not only at APA, it even had started to occur in the 80s with social psychology itself. JPSP, or the history of journals, kind of gets at this as well. So for example, in the 1960s, social psychologists, their primary publication outlet was Journal of Abnormal and Social Psychology. And then in the late 60s, it switched to JPSP. And then in 1980 or thereabouts, we broke it into three groups: the social cognition, the groups, and the personality, which made it much more efficient. It means that even as a social psychologist, you didn't even have to read the other areas of social psychology because you were part of this one group. The system worked just fine. We were all in these little areas, and we talked to other people in our areas. But this is where the revolution started in the 90s, probably the late 90s. And this revolution was the result of two things. This first was technology. With technology, we started to have computers. We now had access to other people in a way that we didn't. But then there was the other, and that was there was this growing realization that the greatest ideas in science occurred at the fringes. Not at the center, not at the center. It's in the interstitial areas between fields. In fact, I would challenge for you to think, what are the greatest ideas in science over the last 30 years? What are the greatest ideas in social and personality psychology? And most of you, when you start thinking about this, will start to realize that wow, most of these great ideas weren't mainline social. They weren't mainline personality. They were findings that were at the areas, and this isn't particularly surprising. News is something that's unexpected. It's something a little bit outside of our knowledge formation. Now, a group of people who learned this, who caught on to this early on, and were people at NIH and NSF. Beginning in the late 90s and the early 2000s, they noticed that the biggest bang for their buck was if people got grants and they were collaborating across areas. Initially, they encouraged people, and now they don't really encourage. They basically say, if you want a grant, you better cross certainly areas, even disciplines, in even universities, because that's where the ideas are. Now, what we're doing is we're starting to see this breakdown, with the breakdown of areas, and I wouldn't call it breakdown so much as a reaching out and starting to talk to other areas. Now, it's been very interesting for me. I've been the department chair at the University of Texas for several years. And one thing that I've noticed, first of all, is the people in our department who get grants are indeed the people who talk to people in other areas. We've got a really active, vibrant group in our department, and almost everybody is publishing with people, not just in the social area. Our social people publish with people in other areas of the department. Most of the members of our faculty publish with other people in the department, but also outside of our department, in neuroscience, in biology, in communications, computer science, and so forth. Now, within an area, a psychology department, one of the interesting questions is, do we even need areas? Are areas an efficient way to think? Now, areas make a certain sense from a managerial perspective. They're efficient and so forth. And if we go back to the early days, areas made good financial sense. But one of the big problems with areas, it was this balkanization, which was now that you have these financial centers that are different areas, what that meant was we moved into a zero-sum game, that the more that one area got goodies, the less others did. And I was part of departments, and I've seen departments go at war at the area level. But with this in the last few years, as we are now starting to talk to people in other areas, from a managerial perspective, areas don't make much sense. Do we need a social and personality area in a department? One of the things that I've been trying to do is to de-emphasize areas. In other words, I want our social psychologists to talk to other areas, because I know they're going to get more grants if they do that. They're going to publish more important things. We've started to change the financial system so that the area still exists if you want it to, but you can create your own node. You can create your own sub-area that might last for a year, for 5 years, forever. Who cares, as long as people are coming up with new and exciting ideas. We're seeing this not just in our department, but we're seeing this in other departments around the country. And one of the interesting experiments is the University of Indiana, which in the last 2 or 3 years has done away with areas altogether. Now, there are also discussions at some universities to do away with departments. Caltech has done this. So now they don't have the traditional departments that we used to have. They have much broader kind of conceptions. Again, the idea is more cross-disciplinary discussions. And at your university, I'm almost certain that your university is working to break down areas or departments as well, so it's easier. It's easier to get grants. It's easier to publish. It's easier to co-teach classes across departments and colleges because it's good for the university. So this is all part of this breaking down of walls. And finally, there's another interesting thing going on, and that is, and I'm not going to get into this in any great detail, and that is the breakdown of universities. Now, when I say this, it doesn't mean the universities are going to go away. It's the breakdown of the barriers between universities. Now, one place that we're starting to see this is with teaching. Sam Gosling and I, for example, have started teaching a giant class that we call a synchronous massive online class, a SMOC. You hear of MOOCs and other things, but the SMOC idea is having a synchronous class where we can now go online, we teach hundreds, thousands, millions of people all at once, and we are going into other universities and teaching classes there. And what this also means is you at your universities can come in and horn in on us, but it also means that there's a kind of a cross-disciplinary way of thinking and a cross-university way of thinking that I guarantee you your senior administrators are talking about right now. Now, you can look at all this with great fear and trepidation, or I would encourage you to look at it with absolute joy and excitement, because I think social psychology is a discipline that is ideally suited to this new world, this cross-disciplinary world, because as social and personality psychologists, we are interested in human interaction. So today what I want to do is talk about how we should start thinking or rethinking about social and personality psychology. And I want to focus on about 3 different things. One is in terms of how we can go about starting to redefine ourselves. The second is how we redefine knowledge dissemination and publication. And the last is redefining graduate education. And with all of this, I'm not saying we do away with it. It's rather just rethinking it. And the first is kind of redefining ourselves. I was trained that a social psychologist is somebody who does work that is published in social psychology journals. Well, that's a pretty stupid definition. Social psychology, to me, really is the study of human beings and their relationships to others. And personality is the study of the individual themselves, often within the context of others. Social psychology and personality, I would argue, need to start thinking more broadly. First of all, thinking about real social behavior. And the first thing that I really would urge is this idea of focusing on all social behaviors, but especially important ones. I've mentioned this before, but one rule I have is something about that I call the taxpayer's perspective. We are all taxpayers, or at least many of us are, and if you aren't yet, by God, you will be. The taxpayer pays for most of our salaries, or certainly pays for our research to some degree. And as a taxpayer, I want some kind of bang for the buck, which means if you're doing research on my dime, I want you to do something that can make a difference. Now, I would bet that most of us went into this discipline because we care about making a difference in the world. We want to make people happier. We want them to drink less. We want them to beat their kids less. We want them to get jobs, and we want them to pay taxes and to make our society happier, healthier, and more productive. As we do our research, we need to be thinking about what are important and meaningful behaviors. So, for example, if you are concerned with prejudice and discrimination in our society, that's wonderful. Can you do something to help reduce it? Started talking by stereotypes, that's fine, but take it to the next step. Can you do something to change objective behaviors? Do something that can make the taxpayer happy. And the reality is, most of us are addressing questions that really do have objective and real world implications, but don't stop with, well, in theory, if this work is done more and more in the future, someone will do it. My call for action is, go out and do it. Try to make a difference. See if you can make a Republican happy. And that, to me, is the gold standard. If you can go and talk to a right-wing Republican and say, I'm doing psychological research and I am reducing taxes for you and your constituents, the Republican is going to say, here, let me give you some more money. So keep that in mind, that we should be focusing on objective behaviors that are important in the culture. Now, the other issue is, in breaking down barriers, we also need to be looking more broadly at what are social behaviors that we should be focusing on. Now, yesterday in the Presidential Symposium, I was really pleased that we were able to bring a number of people here from Microsoft and other groups who are looking at big data, looking at social media. The world has changed over the last several years, and we need to take advantage of this. This is a good example of looking at the real world and starting to study it from a much broader perspective. Another area that makes really good sense that we can take advantage of. Some of the most exciting work is looking at the biological level. Look at some of the exciting work being done with the fMRI world. But a couple of other worlds that we don't seem to pay much attention to, one is hormones. You know, this might sound crazy, but hormones are really, really relevant to social behavior. We should have a huge group of people doing work on hormones. And the revolution in genetics and epigenetics is some work that is deeply relevant to social and personality psychology. We need to do more of that. And by the same token, part of our mission should be to encourage work with non-human animals, looking at monkeys, looking at rats, and carrying on the tradition of social psychology, looking at cockroaches. All of these are the study of social behavior, and these should be in our journals. These are and the people who are doing a lot of this work should be part of this society. We should also be doing more and thinking more about things like mobile apps. There's a whole movement now that's really exciting that's called the quantified self movement. And what the quantified self movement is essentially about is developing apps and other systems so that we can actually track people. We can track parents in their household. We can track little children. We can track people everywhere and start looking at real world behaviors. And the last one, first of all, this is your homework. Over the next week, if you haven't seen it, you are required to go watch the movie Her. Now, you might not like the movie, I don't really care, but I want you to appreciate what some of the implications are for robotics. That over the next over the next several years, we need to start thinking about social psychology in terms of the relationship between people and machines. This is truly deep structured social psychology, and we need to really start exploring this. So this is kind of redefining ourselves in terms of what we mean by social behavior. We need to expand that. The second is we need to rethink knowledge dissemination, and by this I essentially mean publication. We are moving along, and we've got a 19th century publication model. It really did. It worked fabulously in the late 1800s, and actually it worked really well in much of the 1900s. But we now are in a really different world in terms of how we can publish. And there are many ways to do this. One way is for us to start thinking a lot more about open access publishing. Open access does not mean no review. One model is PLOS One, and there are other models that we can build that are really interesting and promising. But what they do is they open up knowledge dissemination to everyone around the world. It's a much faster system, and it's an efficient system. I urge you to look at one of the articles that Brian Nosek published 2 or 3 months ago. And he's laying out some models that have been used in computer science and math. And I want you to look at these models very seriously because they are exciting and really different ways to think. We are now, what we are trying to do, we are all trying to be good scientists, and we're trying to push our ideas out to the world. And there are a lot of different models for this. Now, I'm not saying let's get rid of JPSP. I'm not saying get rid of the journals as they are, at least not yet. I am saying let's start experimenting with some of these other models and see what catches on and what works. And one is, another one that I particularly like is doing what computer science does, which is to have papers based on what we present at a conference, having them peer-reviewed and having them put into the model of citations, because other areas are now doing that. The third redefining issue we need to look at is redefining graduate education. Now, I know many of you in this room are graduate students, and you're thinking, oh, well, this is great. So you want to undermine the whole area that I'm in social psychology, and tell me how in the world am I going to get a job? And many of you are probably thinking, if you have graduate students, well, this is really beautiful, but it has no relevance to jobs. I want you to stop and think a minute. I've looked back at who we've hired in our department. We've hired about 15 people over the last 4 or 5 years. Of those, all but maybe 2 or 3 are in fringe areas, or they are crossing boundaries. We've hired virtually no one who is a mainline anything. We want people who cross areas. So big universities can do this, but what about small universities? Well, I taught at SMU for several years, and I guarantee you at a school like SMU and at other smaller schools, we want people who cross areas. Crossing areas is good. If you have training both in social and developmental, social and computer science, social and neuroscience, you make a lot of people happy. And not only are you more attractive on the job market, you're also more attractive out there in the real world. One other issue is, what is the heart of our training? The heart of our training really is methodology. We want you, when we're training you as graduate students, we want you to go in and really understand experimental design. We really want you to understand statistics. And one thing I would encourage is to start looking at this at a much broader level in terms of getting training in more advanced computer science methods that would be helpful, say, for the analysis of fMRI data. I would hope that you would get training in big data, which includes everything from machine learning, Python, Java, etc. And I guarantee you that opens the number of prospective jobs that would be open to you. So all of this is focusing on how to rethink social and personality psychology. The last thing I really want to do is to kind of change the discussion just a little bit and talk about not so much our group as social psychologists and personality psychologists. I want us to also talk a little bit about our tribe, which is SPSP, the Society for Personality and Social Psychology, and how this also is in a period of flux and also a period of self-reflection. I need to take a little side venture here, so this is kind of a brief history, because many of you don't know anything about SPSP. And I should tell you, I didn't know anything about it until I was elected last year, and it's been a horrifying education. Horrifying because it's a really complex system. SPSP, in some ways, is almost a fluke. What happened was social psychology was developing in the 50s and 60s, and actually, as you know, before that. But then in the early 1970s, up to this time, all of social psychology was essentially housed in APA, and it was all part of Division 8. In the early 1970s, a group of people got together and thought, wouldn't it be nice to have another journal besides APSP, one that would be a more open, experimental kind of journal? And so they came up with the idea of Personality and Social Psychology Bulletin, PSPB. Now here's the problem. APA didn't want to publish it, and so a group of people said, well, I know, why don't we just publish it ourselves? But we couldn't do it under APA, and so the idea was we'd create a separate group, and it was just going to be in name only, called SPSP, so it was a separate society. And I had a really interesting talk with Harry Reese about this. He says the person who modern-day SPSP owes its true history to more than anybody is Bip Latané, who at this time said at the beginning of the PSPB, we have to make this journal, we have to get all the rights for it within SPSP. Don't give it back to the publisher, don't give it to APA, it stays with SPSP. Well, SPSP was created, and then for the next almost 20 years, it really just was a in-name only kind of group. And then in the mid-90s, different deals were made with PSPB and then some other journals, and all of a sudden, some deals, the primary publisher was Sage, more deals were made and more money started to come in. And here all of a sudden, you've got a bunch of academics running this society, and it's starting to bring in money, and they don't know exactly how to do corporations, but you know, we kind of chugged along. And then in about 2000, the idea was proposed, why don't we have our own meeting? And the first one was in Nashville, and some of you may have gone to that, and talking to Harry, he said he was scared to death, and some of the other people were scared to death that nobody would show up and they were going to go broke. But 300 people came, which was far more than they were expecting. And the next year, 600 came. The year after that, over 1,000 came. And very soon, we have what we have now, between 3,000 and 4,000 people. At the same time, the money that was coming in from Sage and the publications started to balloon. So all of a sudden, we're bringing in over $1 million a year. And all of a sudden, here we have this big corporation, and again, we don't know how to run it very well. And many of you have heard about the big embezzlement that occurred a couple of years ago. Well, you know, these things happen when you don't know what you're doing. And this is, by the way, we're all academics. Academics just aren't really good at business. This is one of our weaknesses. In any case, what the embezzlement did was to essentially make us realize that we needed to make this a more professional organization. And I think who we really should thank more than anybody is Jack DeVideo and Trish Devine and also David Funder. That group really did set up a structure to build a professional organization. And so this year what's happening is we're in the middle of a transition. We've had Jack DeVideo as our executive director for the last 4 years, who has essentially led this. But turns out Jack has a real job. And he's still been doing this job as running SPSP for all these years. What we've done is we've hired Chad Rummel. Is Chad here? Chad? You know, I keep doing this. Every time I give a talk, I call out for Chad. He's never here. In any case, I hope you meet him, because Chad Rummel is our new executive director. He is absolutely phenomenal. He's not a social psychologist by training. He spent time working at APA. He understands organizations. He understands how groups work. And he is going to be kind of the professional face of this organization. Now, why have I been telling you all of this? Because one of the interesting things about any kind of group is, as it gets bigger and bigger, and you have a group of people who don't know what they're doing very well, we get more and more people involved, and it makes it really difficult for a group, for a society like ours, to move in any direction, because there are just so many committees, so many people. What this is going to be able to do is to allow us as a society to start moving in specific directions, perhaps more quickly. With that, I am making a few suggestions or some ideas that I think we can think about in this new world as this revolution is occurring, where we are starting to think about breaking down barriers and expanding ourselves. So one of the issues is, over the next few years, we can start to develop a really large web presence, one that we've started, but one that is a very active one that involves really active social media. We've started, but we need to expand this. We also need to start thinking more about having a bigger cultural presence. I've always been interested when I go to Europe, in especially France, England, and Spain, where social psychologists have a really big role in the culture. They are typically people who publish in they often have columns. They are really important in the culture. We need more of this. I get really bothered when I see horrible stuff on television. You see a giant social psychological phenomenon occur, and no one ever bothers to call a social psychologist to comment. Now, sometimes the reason is that we aren't doing important work in that area. We need to fix that. But we're also not reaching out enough to the culture. I think I mentioned yesterday when I was trying to get J.B. Michel, the guy who was the inventor of Google Books, to come and speak. He asked me after several discussions, before he came, he said, "Now, what is a social psychologist? I don't think I've ever met one before." After last night's talk, Eric Horvitz with Microsoft spoke. Afterwards, we were going to meet for dinner, and we were supposed to meet at 8:15. He wasn't there. 8:30, he wasn't there, so I texted him. He said, "Oh, I'm in the poster session. I'll get there as soon as I can." He comes and he says, "I've never seen social psychologists before. This stuff is great." The reality is we need to be pushing ourselves out to the culture as much as we should be bringing those people into our culture. Let's see. What this also means is I would urge us to start thinking in a bigger way, that we should expand our membership. This should not just be a society that we're here because our advisors were social or personality psychologists. Our society should be made up of people interested in social and personality processes, which means people from computer sciences, people from computer engineering, people in animal communication, people in all of these different areas. Social processes are the guts of a culture, and we should be expanding our group. So let me just kind of summarize. The barriers are falling, and in many ways I view this as a wildly exciting time for all of us. And what I would urge, especially you graduate students, now you're in your lab, I want you to look out your window. That's right, you're a graduate student, you don't have a window. But if you did, I want you to look out, or at least break out of your window some. Go and have lunch with a computer scientist. Go have a lunch with somebody in neuroscience. Go have a lunch with people outside of the area, outside of social, and start learning about this much broader world. It's going to give you a better job prospects. It's going to give you a broader worldview that can make you a more productive and exciting psychologist. What I am asking is I want us all to start thinking more about how we can change the culture. By breaking down these barriers, I think we can do that. Thank you. Okay, I think I can answer some questions, or at least entertain questions. I don't know if I can answer them. Okay, yes. Oh, and there's also some microphones in the middle. I don't know if you need them.
I think I can project.
Okay.
I was thoroughly convinced that meetings between different departments and areas and universities was a great thing to have happen. I have some ideas of why that's really great, but I was wondering why you think it's great, because I don't think it's something that
So the question is I'm saying, oh, it would be great for us to talk to people in other areas and so forth. And so why is that important? The reason that's important is that's where the ideas are. The novel ideas are at the nexus, the connections between two areas. So, for example, when I talk to people in computer science as a social psychologist, I come up with a completely new way of thinking about how to measure social behavior. And at the same time, the computer scientists start to understand the nature of social theory and social processes. So going out and talking to these others, you will learn more. You will get a different perspective and come up with ideas that we don't have if we stay inside our own little troop. Yes? Oh, okay, okay. Okay, so the question was, first there was a comment, apparently it's Indiana University and not University of Indiana. Who knew? Okay, but the real question was, in that person's perspective, and also mine, by the way, top-down systems that are pushing people to interact with one another, they don't work. They have never worked at my university that I've seen. They only work, I think, from the bottom up. How can we spur it? I have no idea other than, listen, your career is going to go better if you interact with people outside of your area. Your life will be a lot easier and a lot more enjoyable if you learn ideas outside of your narrow area. So mine is it should be from bottom up. So, and do we need to have structures to push it? Maybe, maybe not. They're already there. Granting agencies, I guarantee you will like it. I think many journals like ideas that are novel, and consequently, those are reinforcing systems. Okay, so the issue is to get this to work better, there needs to be a clear incentive structure. For example, it's often difficult to get interdisciplinary work published in the main journals, which I think is true. That's why I frequently don't publish in the main journals. I publish in journals like PLOS One and others, which also reach a broader audience. And the social psychology journals should be doing this. There should be an incentive structure to do it. So I agree, there are some clear roadblocks, but there are also alternative models to allow us to publish in these other journals. So, for example, you do, in fact, publish in very good journals across the field. You know, it's interesting, I was looking at some of the top cited people in social and personality psychology. These are people like Shelley Taylor and David Buss and Diener and many others. I looked at 10 of these people and the median, and I looked at their top 10 cited publications. The median number of publications in a social or person like JPSP was 1. The rest were in journals outside of the mainline journals within personality and social psychology. Yes, about half of them were in fact in Psych Review, Psych Bulletin, but the others were in specialty journals outside of social and personality. So we're in a new world. We don't have to worry so much about publishing within our area because your deans, your chairs want you to be cited. And we don't care where you publish, we want you to be cited. We want you to do good science that other people will see. Yes?
I think that you also need to realize that the landscape of science is changing very much and that social processes are becoming the focus of science in general. Many people from computer science, physics, and other disciplines being interested in this what used to be our problems. And I think that what often happens is that traditional social psychological theory is not easy for these people to connect. And I think that that we have really wonderful theories and a lot to say that the knowledge we have accumulated. I think it's very important to make this knowledge somehow accessible to people in other areas, also from working, or also maybe by kind of transforming a little bit dynamic. The psychological theories, a little bit more, I would say, dynamical direction where there are more fundamental model of strict sciences. But I think because in a way social psychology is being rediscovered by people that are traditionally out of the discipline. I think it's very important for us, to be in this mainstream that which is now kind of the starting to develop social psychology, or social the new knowledge of social issues.
And so the issue here is that as the areas as physics and computer science and so forth, they are becoming more social in a sense, and we also, I think for us, what we need to be able to do is what you're saying is we also need to translate our theories and ideas into ideas that are readily understandable by people in these other areas, which I think interaction does that. It forces, I'll never forget my first meeting sitting down with a linguist who I've done a lot of work with since. And he starts talking about his work, and I'm thinking, how can you get up in the morning and look yourself in the mirror and say, this is important? And I'm sure he was saying the same thing about me. And it took me forever to figure out, his problem? He's a linguist, and he cares about language. And it never occurred to me that someone studying language actually cares about it. I don't care about it. I care about the person who's speaking the language. I'm interested in language as a measure. But part of this is learning to talk to people and learning what their theories are and also being able to convey our theories in an understandable way. Yes?
Part of breaking out mean that people should be encouraging or faculty should be encouraging their students to think about careers outside.
So the question is should advisors, mentors, faculty be encouraging their students to look at jobs outside of academia? Of course they should. I think that we should be telling our students, look, it's a brutal world out there. You're crazy not to also look at possible jobs in, I mean, there's some fabulous jobs. I look at my own students. I have an amazing group of students, and I'd say a third of them, maybe a third to a half, go out into the real world. Everyone gets a job almost immediately that pays well and is exciting and interesting. And they're doing great social and personality psychology. I would encourage people to look in every direction and find out which is an area that you'd be most happy in. So that's my own bias. Your advisor or other advisors might say, oh, God, Pennebaker, shut up. We only want to replicate ourselves because that's the purpose of graduate school. I have a broader worldview on that. Yes?
So I'm a graduate student now, and I feel like one of the things that I feel like there's a lot of incentive to just do a lot of really quick studies, a lot of 2x2 ANOVAs, and so stick with what you know because there's such an incentive to get published. And I feel like part of what's disincentivizing about this kind of exploratory approach is you don't know where you're going to get published, you don't know how long it's going to take to learn, dynamical methods, you don't know how long it's going to take to learn, computer science or whatever. Are there sort of solutions? I think you sort of alluded to them, like in terms of publishing or in terms of how we evaluate what a good scientist is, that could make it more heavily incentivized for people to be interdisciplinary.
My guess would be I look around the room here and I know there's some people here who could actually talk to you afterwards. I want you to appreciate what it's like on my side, which is when I'm looking to possibly hire somebody. I don't necessarily want a bunch of publications. I want to see, does this person have some good ideas? Does this person have the potential to be a good scientist? And they might just have 1 or 2 publications. I'd want to be pretty good publications, but you've got 4, 5, 6 years to do that, and to do something that's important with important outcomes. I'm personally going to look at you a lot longer than I am someone who has 5 good publications that are all 2x2s that are really just a replication of your advisor. Now, maybe I'm different, but I don't think so. I think all of us are looking for people who have the potential, who really care about science and ideas with an eye toward making a difference in the world. Yes?
I'm sort of interested in some of the things you're saying. One is, in part, because I'm not a social psychologist, I'm an educational researcher. And I became interested in social psychology because it's addressing an issue that I saw to be a problem in the improvement of student outcomes, in that most of the emphasis within of the people that I was working with was on how to make teachers more effective or school environments more effective in producing outcomes in students, but they weren't particularly concerned, directly at least, in how to increase the students' interest or willingness or valuing of their educational experience. And were sort of, in effect, undermining, I thought, the end to which they hoped to attain. So I began reading a good deal in the social psychology literature too, starting with William James actually working forward, and found a great deal of useful material, which is sort of like, as you move along, finding out that you've discovered a place where there's a lot of people already. So, and that's why I'm here. Now, most of the people I study with don't know much about social psychology. And I imagine the same is true. Social psychologists don't know that much about the people concerned with education. That's just one area, although I see more overlap now than I did a few years ago. A case in point, though, is a question, in a part, as to how to achieve this, but an example, I think, is perhaps in the bioscience and technology program at Harvard University in medicine. What they were concerned about was they had people who were good clinicians who didn't understand technology and good technicians who didn't understand medicine. And they tried to they created an interdisciplinary study program where people who were engineers would learn about the clinical sciences, and people who are already clinicians, some of whom were, say, thoracic surgeons, would learn about engineering. And they could learn each other's language. It was a little bit more effortful. But in partial response to what was just said, that we feel the burden of not having all the tools and not all the knowledge and even not all the questions. But that was an extremely effective collaboration where you have, in the end, say a clinician who has maybe a few credits short of a master's degree in electrical engineering. Because what was the output was is that they had engineers who built things that could be used by clinicians, and you had clinicians who knew how to make use of those tools.
Right, and I think what you're saying is really gets to the point in terms of how we can get cross-disciplinary systems working more effectively. Yes?
Jamie's saying. It might be from the perspective of being old. Sorry, Jamie. But I share that attribute with Jamie, and I want to present it to you. People need to be worried about the incentives. The incentive should be there's opportunity to be realized. It's a chance. You're putting yourself out there. The worst that could happen, two things. You'll be challenged in potentially really, really interesting ways. And the second is you'll have good people to have wine with and dinner with and so on. I mean, the idea here is, and I actually think Jamie's spot on, departments are changing. The balkanization is not working. We're seeing that the insularity that we've done to ourselves over a great many years is actually interfering with our ability to be part of the dialogue on public discourse and part of the dialogue on real world problems. So let me just challenge you to accept Jamie's recommendations, not as a requirement, the homework assignment go to the movie, but as really an opportunity, an invitation that may be realized in the form of you doing science that will make a difference. So Jamie, I just want to say I think you're right on.
And Trish Devine is a really insightful person, as you can tell. Yes. The microphones are now working.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Can you hear me now? No. I think I got educated in social psychology a little too early for my interest because I've always been very interested in applied aspect of social psych. So I was educated in the 80s, did the social psychology traditional PhD, combined that also with an organizational IO psych PhD, then chased and did a postdoc and did a forensic psychology postdoc with a master's in that level so that I could finally, through this interdisciplinary research, do the kinds of things I want to do. I teach, but I've always been searching for that voice that social psychology can have in the real world. So now with this other training, the work I do with organizations, the work I do with in the legal field has allowed that, and where I think that social psychology finally now may have an opportunity, a very important one, is to finally do that as a social psychologist without having to branch out in so many other areas. And so the challenge, I think, and what I have with my students is to tell them what else they can do with a social psych degree besides being in academia. And with one of the major goals in psychology, besides being with adjustment and what the clinicians have done, is to have healthier, happier people in our world. Those are the kind of opportunities that I wish we could more solidify as to where can you go, other than you can now work with courts, you can work with consumer. I had a student the other day just say to me, I really love the theories in the area of social psych, but I don't want to be in consumer psychology. And I had to let him know there were so many other areas to go into, but I think that's a challenge, as where are the jobs
Let me just make one observation. In addition to the many, many jobs out there in the real world, I can tell you that my students can get jobs in departments of communication, departments of information sciences, even some computer sciences, some in linguistics and sociology. The fact is that if you are broadly trained, you don't have to be in a department that's just is social psychology. Oh, and I should tell you, there's a large number of people at this conference who are in business schools, in medical schools. I mean, there's so many opportunities. Back there.
First of all, I want to say that I think that applied social psychology is a great area for people to specialize in. But I think we should also watch out not to pour the baby with the bathwater. And although make a Republican happy is a great soundbite, I think that bench science and a lot of the work that many of my colleagues are doing here is important, even if we can't necessarily recognize the immediate applicability of the work. So theory is, the best practical element that one can think of, and a lot of the things that I built on were completely inapplicable in their origin, and I actually took it probably one step further towards applicability. And someone that will be maybe potentially smarter than me will take my work and hopefully make it even more applicable. So I think we should be careful with trying to push what I felt was always some of the interactions with the non-social psychology world, whereas, okay, but how is your work going to influence my life in an immediate manner? And I had many discussions with a lot of individuals, and I hope that I made some of them convinced in the value of non-practical necessarily or non-applicable work as well. But I think we should make sure that our field itself is not getting drawn into the let's make a taxpayer happy and the popularity contest to evaluate research kind of perspective.
Let me just make it clear. I'm not saying that all of our research needs to make a Republican happy. What I'm saying is I want our research to be important. And it doesn't need to be applied right away. I look at my own work. I've done much of my early work was very much lab-based, highly controlled. But at the back of my mind, I was thinking this has potential to make a difference. And it sounds like your work has made Republicans happy yourself. And my point is we have a field that we have the potential to make the world a better place. Not today, perhaps, not tomorrow, maybe not in several years, but it doesn't hurt for us to be thinking in that bigger way. I don't think you and I actually disagree. Yes.
Yes, so you spoke quite a bit about the balkanization of departments. I would like to draw some attention to the balkanization within social psychology itself. Walking around, and I know that many of you, I don't know if you will disagree with this or not, but I saw many posters and I've seen many talks that have basically restated something that we sort of already know. I don't know if you guys agree or disagree, but I'm wondering your thoughts, and I want to draw attention to the conversation in general, to not subdividing anymore, but drawing together. And I think somebody made a comment also about other fields don't know what we're doing. Well, I think it would be great if we could come up with 5 or 10 basic things about that we know for sure about humans, and we can say, okay, world, here's what we've done in the last 35 years. Here, you know what I mean? And I'm just wondering about whether you think that would be useful, whether you think that there's potential.
Actually, that kind of task of kind of important breakthroughs in social and personality over the last X number of years is actually done quite a bit. And talk to Lisa Munoz, who's our public affairs officer, who I think could actually help answer that. One issue, this balkanization issue, I want to make it clear there's a difference between balkanization versus talking to your own troop. So, for example, we have the pre-conference system. I think the pre-conference system is fabulous because this year I can go into this pre-conference and really get involved with it, and then in a year or 2 or 3 years I might be off in some other pre-conference. It's not as though I'm in this area for my career and I'm only going to be talking to the people in my career. That's what I mean by balkanization. I think talking to people about the research areas that you're involved in is critical for you to be a good scientist. Yes?
So I'm a classically trained experimental social psychologist who works in a medical school. And I just wanted to throw out a concept that I think takes us further than cross-disciplinary or having conversations with people outside our department. And the concept I want to throw out is integrative science, because I think we're mistaking, or at least I did it originally when I started, mistaking having those conversations as being on the fringes, the fish scale, the person who has got no home, no place to go, right? The canary in the coal mine. And that wasn't my experience. I was the canary in the coal mine, but my experience was through that process of being on the fringe. The new ideas were because I learned and understood the concept better, more richly, deeper, and it was that integrative science that allowed me to connect to the real world, because I was talking about something real now because I understood it from so many different perspectives. So I guess I would just advocate, in terms of a rhetorical perspective, the use of thinking about, an integrative approach to something that's systematic and maybe can help our endeavor a little bit.
Actually, you've rephrased what I was thinking really nicely. I've been talking about the great discoveries are on the fringe, but the idea is initially they're the fringe, but that's where, it does start to bring a new center. And then in just a matter of a few years, people are going to be revolting against that, and there'll be new fringes. But it's all integrative, yeah. Okay, I think we have time for maybe one more question, a couple more questions. Yes?
Hello? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I enjoy your talk. I wholeheartedly agree. I also suspect that when I go back home, I will not have that meeting with the computer scientist, not because I don't agree, but because there are a few thresholds there that are hard to overcome. So I heard a nice talk this morning by Nick Norton, where they were proposing this idea of matchmaking, where a third party would say, hey, you and you should meet. And so, since this is not my work, but I thought it was great, I just kind of mentioned it to all of you, especially those of you who are in the faculty, that when you go back home, even if you don't feel like meeting with the computer scientist, you can try to matchmake maybe one of your colleagues with the computer scientist, and vice versa. So that's one thing. Another one is, if you really want to do this, you can sign up on the website of Stick With It, where if you don't do the going to meet with the computer scientist, then you have to end up paying money to some organization that you really don't like the NRA would be, for example. So that's the second one, if you really want to implement these things. And then the third thing that I want to say, which is more at the level of institutions, it is great to come to a conference that is in an area that is different from mine. I learned a lot. It's terrific. It's also a little like going to a party where you don't know anybody. So and I think that probably I speak for many of you, that on the one hand, it's great to go to something new. On the other hand, if I keep going to psychonomics, then I keep meeting all the same friends and all. And so I wonder whether there is a room for some institutional ways to work that problem.
There are, and it's been interesting looking at different universities, how they sometimes deal with this. Talk to your dean, talk to your president about sponsoring dinners with the people from different areas. In our psychology department, we have periodic lunches where the chair brings in 6 to 8 randomly selected faculty members for lunch, and they talk about whatever they want. It's in terms of research. A lot of papers and projects have come from this, and people, even in the same department, who had no idea about each other, realized that they were studying very similar things. So I think there are institutional ways to help push this this collaboration. And it's true, many of us come back to this society or other societies because we have a bunch of friends here. And, hey, it turns out that's social psychology. That's okay. But we can also go out the door occasionally as well. Okay, one last question.
Any ideas about how we get around this problem that we can do good research, we can get it out, but it's going to have no impact because of the polarized political environment? so that you can have great gun control studies, you can have great environmental studies, you can tell them about the diversity studies, but it's going to immediately be activated by people in one pole or another, and they're not going to be listening. I mean, maybe social psychologists are really an ideal group to say, maybe we call it something different. Our research, we frame it as not global warming, but climate change. Maybe we call versus something else that's going to have that kind of polarized thing. But how do we take that additional step, have that kind of impact, even when the research is really good and even if we get it out there?
So the question is, we may do research that could make a difference in terms of the culture, but it's so politically charged that half the culture won't listen to it. This is outside of my area of expertise. It turns out there are a lot of people here who study topics just like that, but that's one that is a very tough one. I think that's the perfect answer to a final question. Thank you all very much.